Ladies and gentlemen, can we please urge you to take your seats urgently? We would like to begin very shortly. Sorry to interrupt your discussions and your breakfast, but you can bring it with.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sam Kokeli. I always greet everyone as if it's evening, just in case somebody is stuck in the dark somewhere. We know nowadays it's hard to always have the lights on. It's one of those oddities and the difficulties about our lives. I grew up, I remember my first experience of electricity growing up in the township of Mdantsane in the Eastern Cape. It was an amazing, amazing innovation and an experience. And before that, we had candles, and I find myself having to have one as backup nowadays, and I still think I yearn for those days in the 80s when we take a giant leap into the world of electricity. Welcome to this special day where we unpack the budget, and thanks to the family at Deloitte, wonderful friends of South Africa, and I'm looking to disappear from the stage as quickly as possible because there's a jam-packed lineup and great people behind me, great moderators, panelists, people who will make sense of what happened last week. And we have one of the players, the commissioner himself, Commissioner at SARS. And before we get on with our program, just a few things, really housekeeping, to let you know, ladies and gentlemen, that should you want to use the bathrooms, they're right behind me, to my left. You turn around, there's a giant screen right behind that giant screen. And then we're going to get cracking with the day and looking forward to it. And we want to welcome the viewers online. We've got, I'm told, wonderful numbers and people who've made a time to be with us this morning. Last time we were here, it was a very impactful day. We had one of the keynote speakers, Commissioner, together with the Director General at the Treasury, who made an announcement, Commissioner, in a very coded way about his future. It might also be a wonderful opportunity for the Commissioner to tell us, now there's a vacancy at ESCOM. And now there's a vacancy at ESCOM, Commissioner, or two. Itireleng Kubeka is itching to get cracking with it, to welcome you all, Head of Tax and Legal at Deloitte Africa. Itireleng, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm not so sure about itching, but I'm here now. 5 years ago, I could never have imagined that I would be standing here in front of you hosting this awesome event. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming here and spending your morning with us. You could have chosen to be anywhere else, but you chose to be here. We are honored by your presence. I would like to welcome the Commissioner, Mr. Edward Kieswetter, who is our keynote speaker for today. He is here with some of the senior leadership from the SARS team. Welcome. We are honored to have you here. Please also allow me to welcome Dr. Mampo Modise, the Deputy Director General for Public Finance from the National Treasury. Thank you for being here. Please do thank the Minister for the 13 billion that he has given back to us via tax breaks in our pockets. It will go a long way in realizing the constraints that our consumers have felt over the past year. I would like to welcome our moderators, Hilary Joffe and Guguletu Mfupi. And a warm welcome to our panelists who will be joining us later on in the program, Dr. Tabi Leoka and Professor Mcebisi Gletiana. Welcome to our clients and our stakeholders, those of you in the room and those of you online. Thank you for choosing to spend your morning with us. Members of the media, you are welcome. In the room, we also have our CEO, Rowena Redfern, colleagues from our Deloitte Africa Executive Committee, and finally, but not least, our Deloittians, both in the room and online. My name, as you've just heard, is Itireleng Kubeka. I am the Managing Director of the Deloitte Africa Tax and Legal. I joined the firm a year ago, almost a year ago, last year in April. And I have spent the last 20 years of my career in the corporate world. So for those of you who are concerned about my age, that should sort that out. I'm proud and honored to stand here before you and to continue Deloitte Africa's tradition of hosting the post-budget event for our clients and our stakeholders. As Deloitte Africa, we aim to be a trusted partner to help our clients navigate change and uncertainty in areas using our multidisciplinary model. This could be in the area of tax, of audit, of business processing engineering, human capital, digital, cyber risk, or financial advisory, to just name a few. All of these areas are facing rapid change, and we are here to help our clients adapt to this change, and you find all this help under one roof. In order to assist customers in making effective business decisions, we must help them comprehend the political and economic environment in which their business operates. The national budget of a country is one of the most important tools that can be used to assess the state of the economy and its public finances. It serves as the roadmap for the country's economical, fiscal, and social development. That is why we found it necessary to host what we hope will be an open, honest, and robust conversation around the budget speech that was delivered by the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, last week. When we hosted our pre-budget media roundtable at the beginning of the month, we called on government to spend the next year focusing on containing the rising prices to help reduce the cost of doing business and shielding households from the high costs of living crisis that has engulfed us over the past year. We also urge governments to protect the tax base by providing relief to individual taxpayers, widen the VAT exemption, and suspend the fuel levy. We will spend this morning in a deep dive to discover if the government has gone far enough to achieve these goals. This budget comes at a very pivotal time in our economy and our country and will determine our long-term trajectory. The Minister of Finance focused on the energy crisis, the debt relief to Eskom, transport and logistics, and fiscal health. However, questions still remain on how government will practically solve the pressing socio-economic issues that face our country. Will the trade-offs in this budget result in adequate long-term solutions to solve our economic situation? In addition to the current challenges last Friday, we received the news that South Africa has been grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force. This is in spite of the efforts acknowledged by the minister that were made to avoid this move. I hope we can spend part of this morning deliberating on what this means for our country and how it impacts our clients. Of course, none of these spending plans outlined last week would be possible if it was not for the efficient and robust revenue collection. Revenue collection has been one of the key pillars of success in South Africa's democracy. The reform and repositioning of SARS 26 years ago brought about an institution that has been a center of excellence in the public service, accompanied by improved collection, as well as tax morality and compliance. Efficient revenue collection has enabled a new democratic government to fulfill its many functions to a broader, previously excluded base of the population. Most importantly, it has enabled South Africa to establish and maintain the most comprehensive social wage in the developing world, comprising social grants, free and subsidized housing, no-fee schools, and free basic services. This has been essential in maintaining social stability in the face of high unemployment. As announced in this budget, tax revenue collections for the 2022-2023 year exceeded the 2022 budget expectation by an estimated 93.7 billion to total 1.7 trillion, an achievement which I believe deserves an applause. We also heard from the Minister that further funding will be provided to SARS to bolster revenue collections capabilities in future years. This morning, we are honored to have with us the man under whose stewardship this critical function has been undertaken since May 2019, Mr. Edward Kubeka. Commissioner Kubeka, allow me to welcome you once again and thank you for the good work that you and your team are doing. We hope that we will spend this morning talking about your next challenges and how we as Deloitte and as South African taxpayers will be able to achieve your goals. Ladies and gentlemen, he formerly served as the founding group executive of the SARS Large Business Center and High Net Worth Unit, SARS Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Commissioner during the period 2004 to 2009. He held various executive roles, including at Alexander Forbes Group Holdings as the Group Chief Executive, and also held posts at First Rand Banking Group and Eskom. Most recently, he managed his own investments and served on various boards. His qualifications include a Master's of Commerce in South Africa and International Tax Law, an Executive MBA from Henley Business School in the UK, and a Master of Science in Education. He was awarded the prestigious African American Scholarship and an academic appointment as an Associate in Education at Harvard University in the United States of America. He's also the recipient of several awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Management in 2017 from SAPSO, finalist in the All African Business Awards in 2016, ACO Dealmaker of the Year in 2015, and South African Boss of the Year in 1999. He serves as a visiting professor at the Da Vinci Institute, as well as Free State University, and remains involved as a social activist in his personal capacity. He rejoined SARS in 2019 as SARS Commissioner. Without further ado, I would like to welcome onto the stage our guest speaker, SARS Commissioner, Mr. Edward Kubeka.
Sanibonani nonke. Goeiemorgen. Good morning. I actually just while I was sitting there received a SMS from SARS to remind me that today is the final day for provisional. So I'll have to talk to my banker today. I'd like to acknowledge our host, the tax boss of Deloitte, Ms. Itireleng Kubeka, formerly the managing director, who is formerly the managing director of Deloitte Africa Tax and Legal, as well as her boss, Ms. Ruwaida Ibrahim, the Deloitte Big Boss CEO, as well as the Deloitte team. So you can see I'm being managed by two powerful women this morning. I better watch my step. I'd also like to welcome some of my own colleagues, especially the three executives who are responsible for actually collecting the money. I'm just the poster boy. Mr. Johnson Makubu, who is our Chief Revenue Officer, Ms. Natasha Singh, who heads up the High Wealth Individual segment, and next to her, Mr. Nasizio Makwakwa, who heads up the Large Business and International, and my other colleagues of SARS, and also Dr. Mampo Modise, the DDG of Public Finance. I always say that if South Africa were a company, then we would represent the income statement of the P&L, and she and her colleagues would represent the expenditure side of the P&L. And our battle is to try and out-earn them. They spend faster than what we can earn most of the time, but thankfully we have managed to stabilize around a primary surplus. Let's see how long that lasts. I remember in 2007, as one of the deputy commissioners, we delivered our first revenue surplus, which was destroyed after the 2008 financial market crisis, and hopefully we can get back there. Once again, good morning to everyone here and online. I imagine that over the past few days, many, if not most of you, had to juggle your program around the load-shedding challenges. One of the most well-used app, I guess, is Eskom Sepush. I'm sure you also have shared stories of how you have dodged the potholes in your neighborhood, or relate a narrow escape from being a victim of crime. We moan about the fact that crime and corruption appear to be out of control, and we routinely budget for private security, private healthcare, and private education. It's become the characterization of the South African way of life. And yet, if you are in the room this morning and connected online, we form part of a privileged minority who have a job, who have probably already invested in some standby power, and even claimed from our insurances the wheel that we've had to replace on that one Friday night when you missed the pothole, when you didn't miss the pothole. I hear many ask, why do we pay tax? Others even advocating for a tax revolt. I have to ask you, when you say we get nothing for our tax money, who do you include in this we? Or has it reduced to an exclusive we of one? Do you, for example, include the gogo, who without the tax money would not receive an old age grant at the end of the month and be destitute? Or the young mother whose life depends on the child support grant? Or 29 million other people who anxiously waits once a month for a small respite through the social grant, often meager, but life-changing for them? Do you include in your we the 7 out of 10 young people who, despite trying, cannot find work? Or the millions who rely on public health care and schooling? Here's why I believe we should pay our taxes. Firstly, if we don't, we hurt the most vulnerable in society. You think you may be acting against government, but actually you are punishing the most vulnerable. Secondly, you simply become one of those who contribute towards our already challenging state of lawlessness. You cannot select which law you want to break and which you want to uphold. So if you break the tax law, it is a crime, inexcusable as any other crime. And thirdly, we're a democracy. We exercise agency. If you don't like what the government is delivering, then use your democratic right to vote. We have a government we deserve. And so until and unless we stand up and act, moaning around our dining room tables or at our favorite shebeen, will not change a thing. Every fundamental change in South Africa have come about because ordinary South Africans have exercised their agency. They have said, till here and no further. And I would like to encourage more South Africans to come off the cunt lane, the sideline, and to find out what is it that we can do differently instead of celebrating our own self-fulfilling prophecy of doom. Without a well-functioning revenue administration, our democracy would be in even deeper trouble. The fiscal stability which the Minister of Finance is committed to and has maintained would not be achievable if SARS is not effective and efficient. That's why we fight with Dr. Modise and her colleagues to give us more money. Because it is an investment in South Africa that has the highest return. It is the lowest hanging fruit to close the tax gap, to improve compliance, and not to raise taxes. And in South Africa, the bad news is the good news. The low levels of compliance, the high levels of crime is what we need to attend to. The 12,500 employees at SARS are inspired by this sense of higher purpose, knowing, understanding that our work is transformative. Yes, we administer laws we harass you to give your taxes. But actually, the why of our work is what inspires us. Our work has a transformative impact on the lives of South Africans, and almost always those who without government would be destitute. It is not one big thing that we get right at SARS. It is many, many little things. Recently, to inspire and motivate our staff, I wrote a letter and drew on the famous quotation by Al Pacino in Any Given Sunday. If you haven't listened to it, listen to the clip in the locker room when he says, "The inches to win are everywhere. An inch to the left and you lose it, an inch to the right and you win it." And so at SARS, of course, we rely on a healthy economy and appreciate the additional contribution from the financial, mining, and manufacturing sector this year, even though mining is beginning to show a decline. There is no straight line correlation between what happens in the economy and what happens in the revenue collection. In between is the effective and efficient administration of those laws. When tax revenue delivers a 7.6% year-on-year growth, as the minister is now challenging us to achieve, in an economy that has only grown by 5.8% nominally, then something else is happening. The additional 94 billion that the minister announced means that we will achieve a tax buoyancy of 1.4%. So in this, the inches we win are everywhere. Let me share with you some of these inches. More than 60 billion would not have been in the fiscus as at the end of January if it were not for managing and resolving 1.4 million outstanding debt cases. And this means often a follow-up SMS, a phone call, a letter of demand, a civil judgment, a third-party appointment. And it is cumulatively this work by our staff that yields 61 billion rand that would not have been in the coffers. We cannot manually assess 14 million returns that we have as at the end of January of all tax types collected. We cannot do it manually. So we rely on the crunching of millions of demographic profiles, of bits and bytes of data to risk profile every single of those 14 million returns using data science and data and artificial intelligence. In addition to providing a seamless experience to about 3 million standard income taxpayers who this year had to do nothing, if they agreed with our assessment, they would have received their refund in under 72 hours. In doing this work, of the 14 million, we have selected about 1.7 million through our risk engine, our risk profiling algorithms. And by the way, of almost 4 million VAT returns, 92%, in other words, more than 9 out of every 10, would have been processed seamlessly without any intervention. And 8 out of the 100 would have been selected for a refund, for a verification. And of the 8, 6 would have been processed within 21 days. And you hear the other 2 tweeting about how ineffective and how useless we are. SARS has managed through this work to detect and prevent the growing attacks on our refund system and have prevented the impermissible or fraudulent refunds through the use of AI and ML, and have added 61 billion rand to the fiscus this year. 61 billion that would have flowed out as impermissible or fraudulent refunds had we not done this piece of work. The inches we need to win are everywhere. Let me share with you some more inches. Our specialized auditing function this year have completed over 700 audits, yielding 4.2 million in revenues. And some of the interventions included 17 lifestyle audits that yielded over 200 million rand, 65 luxury vehicle audits, almost 660 million rand. Yeah, people, they love to post pictures of their cells and their Porsches on Facebook. 15 religious entities, totaling a further 25 million. 68 pay-as-you-earn, ETI attempts to fraud, totaling over 600, almost 680 million rand. And 8 PPE tender assessments that brought in 422 million rand. In our large business section, this young man sitting here, they've conducted over 200 audits and investigations, yielding 13 billion rands of additional revenue. So if you, the next time you accuse us of only chasing the little guys, think about where the 13 base erosion and profit shifting cases came from that yielded 3 billion rand. Our customs audits have yielded 10 billion rand, including 4,732 seizures that have prevented illicit, illegal, or mispriced goods from coming into our economy to distort it, of 3 billion rand. We have over 334 investigations underway of syndicated crime, and another 413 that we have preliminary profiled. We've completed of these 215 cases, recovering 4 billion rand, including 500 million from Zondo-related cases. In our criminal investigation division, we have over 700 cases that are currently underway. We've handed 178 of these cases to the NPA. They have effectively prosecuted 94 with a conviction rate of 98.7%. 92 out of the 98 cases have yielded successful prosecutions due to the quality of work and the comprehensive nature of the files we give them to ensure successful prosecution. SARS has litigated successfully a number of areas where important principles of transfer pricing, of the abuse of trust attribution rules, of when is a royalty payment dutiable, and how do we better manage the aggressive degree of trade mispricing. We've laid some very important precedent-setting outcomes this year. By the way, our conviction rate, litigation rate, is over 90% in tax and 85% in customs. And that brings certainty to the system. Some other concerns that we have is increasingly large companies abusing international tax and transfer pricing provisions, the abuse of parent to subsidiary company relationships, exotic structurings that have no commercial rationale, international arrangements, loan agreements that have no other purpose but to unlawfully or aggressively minimize the tax stake. Of course, these takes longer, they are more complex, and there is no way. I once said to a large corporate that your tax department budget is as large as the entire budget of SARS. We know that sometimes we go to a gunfight with nothing but a nail clipper. We know that we are the David, we are not the Goliath in the story of David and Goliath. And yet it is the hard work, the consistent effort, and the high expectation you have of our 12,500 staff that this year has yielded 167 billion rand that would not have been in the coffers were it not for the work we do. We also are concerned about the data leaks. You've heard about the Pandora and the Panama Papers. We now have the unique names of 436 South Africans whom we have detected through the work with International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. When journalists do well, they do very well. When they don't, they do very bad. We have automatic exchange of information with almost 100 jurisdictions that tells us about South Africans who have financial assets abroad. And so when we announce, when the minister extends our revenue challenge by a further 93 billion, it is that work, those are the inches that we have to follow up to ensure that the tax revenue which is due, in fact, ends up in the coffers of state. And we have to do that. If our compliance level were 100%, we wouldn't need SARS. We would just be a receiving agent, not a collecting agent. But because we have compliance levels of the early 60%, we know that that plus the proliferation of criminal, tax crime, syndicated crime, means that SARS has to be ever more vigilant. And we are not ready to declare victory. We have a long way to go. But we are encouraged that the work is slowly yielding dividends. In the recent public opinion survey, the public rated an increase from 71.8 to 76.5% confidence in SARS. That's encouraging, that we are beginning to shift the dial and hopefully also see that follow through in increased levels of compliance. We still have a long way to go, and we are encouraged by those South Africans, intermediaries, who are committed to this important ambition of fiscal integrity, of fiscal stability. We encourage you to work with us to improve the entire ecosystem. We cannot do without you. And we ask you to join with us in this work for the benefit of our democracy, the one we all profess to love. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Commissioner. If I may please invite you back on stage. Apologies, Commissioner, we're not done with you just yet. We've got a few things. Thank you so much for that wonderful input. If you could please grab a seat on stage, and Hilary Joffe, editor-at-large at Business Day, I'm going to invite her to come on stage. She will be driving this conversation, and I will also be inviting back on stage. Come through, Hilary, please. Itireleng Kubeka. Itireleng comes back on stage. We'll have a fascinating conversation about what the Commissioner may have said or may not have said about the budget and the budget itself, the environment. And without further ado, thank you. Hilary. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Commissioner. It was a really compelling answer to one of the questions I was going to ask, which is, what do you say to people who say, well, why should we give the money to the government? They will just waste it, or worse. And I think you've given us a really compelling answer to that question. But I'm going to start with Itireleng. How do you respond to the Commissioner's words? Do they address the concerns that your clients have with the South African Revenue Service? If not, what are the outstanding concerns that you'd want to raise?
Thank you, Hilary. I think the Commissioner raised some very important points. The one is the reflection on always looking and remembering the other side. And that there is non-compliance, you are not taking the government. There is the other gogo who's not receiving their grant as a result. And that's always an important reflection for us to remember as we become tax compliant. And the Commissioner also talked to the work that they are doing. And I'm very glad to hear that you are using data science and artificial intelligence in identifying whether it's fraud or assessing tax returns, which is really great to see. And I think the Revenue Authority has to focus on looking at encouraging voluntary compliance. And voluntary compliance comes with a certain level of trust. And for there to be trust, there has to be certainty, there has to be clarity. Taxpayers and clients would like to know that they are being treated fairly, that there is friendly, fair, and effective systems and procedures in place to ensure compliance and assessment. And the compliance has to be easy, it has to be simple, it has to be made as easy as possible. And that brings me to my question to you, Mr. Commissioner. The minister talked to increasing the revenue, the allocation to the SARS. Could you take us into your confidence and let us know how much that is and what you intend, how do you intend on using it in improving the compliance burdens that you are experiencing?
I'll know what the amount is as soon as I get a letter from Mampo. I think what is important acknowledgement by the Minister is that since the unfortunate period of state capture, when, according to Nugent, SARS was deliberately weakened and there was a visible, marked decline in integrity and governance. It's interesting if you look at that period, how the tax buoyancy had dipped below 1. In other words, the revenue growth was lower than the nominal growth in the economy. The only other time that we did that was in 2008, when we had the 2008 subprime market crisis. And then, of course, during COVID, there was an aberration, a once-off aberration, which we have all but recovered. Last year, in fact, the revenue growth was 25% year on year, but importantly, 15.4% higher than the pre-COVID level. Those are all positive signs. So what are we doing? We are building an enabling environment, or so-called operating model, that enables us to deliver 3 things, which are the 3 of our 9 strategic objectives to achieve voluntary compliance. The first is we need to do more to provide clarity and certainty. So you'll see an investment in education for ordinary taxpayers. We still have too many, especially blue-collar workers, who comes to our queues, and even though we've been successful in disintermediating over 10 million such transactions in the last few years, we still find people coming to the queues. How do we do more to reach out and to educate them? We have worked hard to make progress on advanced pricing agreements. We've re-established a focus group to look at providing more private and public rulings. The gold standard there for us ultimately is to work towards a cooperative compliance program. And we are in discussion with some large corporates who we can use as a guinea pig to walk that journey. The gold standard on customs is the authorized economic operator, where effectively, through accreditation, a company would be eligible for a green lane experience. So, but to do that, we need to do a lot more big data work and using artificial intelligence to provide that seamless experience. That's the first objective, to provide clarity and certainty. And in the past, we have somehow let ourselves down by not stepping up the investment in that area. It sounds insignificant, but it's not. The second is an ease of compliance, and there again, using data science and augmenting the effort of people by insights from data. Our aim is to make tax a non-event. We really want tax to be something you get an invoice once a year and a thank you note. And we're already able to do that for 3 million individual taxpayers, and increasingly we can do that for more taxpayers. But that requires the investment in data science and also bringing into SARS smart people, data scientists, technology people, technology smarts to build that environment. And I can give you more examples, but that effectively is the journey that we are on. And as we do that better, we'll achieve two things. We'll achieve the most effective and efficient experience that we can give to taxpayers and traders without compromising the risk to the fiscus, and ensure that the taxes that are due, in fact, ends up in the coffers of government.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Grey listing, Friday night's grey listing is, I think, top of mind for a lot of us, adding to really a lot of self-inflicted harm that South Africa feels like it's already done itself. Can I ask you to sort of look at grey listing in the context of the kind of numbers that you have given us on SARS's successes in improving compliance? You've talked about hundreds of cases and billions of rands that you have managed to get in tax revenue from dodgy dealings, if you like, broadly speaking. And you've also talked about hundreds of cases that you have passed on to the prosecuting authorities. We know from what the Financial Action Task Force's 8 strategic outstanding items tell us, that South Africa's problem is the policing and law enforcement side of it. It's not the laws and the rules and regulations. First of all, from SARS's side, is that gap between what you pass on to the law enforcement authorities and what actually happens a real concern? Because that seems to be a lot of what is happening. It's not that banks don't report suspected crimes, but that they don't get followed up. Is SARS having some of those challenges with our law enforcement authorities, number one? And number two, to the extent that you are succeeding, very high rates of successful prosecution when you do get prosecutions, what advice would you give to the other kind of entities who are kind of struggling to get implementation on what FATF is really asking us to do, which is finding the flows and stopping them, the illicit flows?
So thanks, Hilary. So let me first say that the term grey listing is an unfortunate term because you're not on the list, then you're on a grey list, and then you're on a blacklist. But what grey listing means is that you are under increased surveillance because you have outstanding actions. And it's a very tick-the-box, rule-driven process, which is unfortunate because what it does not assess is the overall strength of the system. And South Africa is an interconnected system. And when the mutual evaluation took place in 2019, we were just at the low end of the impact of state capture. And organizations such as SARS, the NPA, the Hawks, were consciously and deliberately repurposed to serve a corrupt intent. And let me tell you from personal experience, rebuilding institutional integrity is hard work. In private sector, we cannot offer, for example, the remuneration packages to attract. I've been in the market for 2 years to employ a chief data scientist and a chief technology innovation officer. It's hard to attract good people to government. And I think institutions like the NPA and the Hawks, not for lack of trying, are struggling to rebuild capability. So we have to understand that that's where we are. Notwithstanding, we also scored a few own goals. So for example, one of the areas that we have not done enough work in is access to beneficial ownership, because lots of individuals who are involved in terror financing or money laundering, they often do it through intermediated entities. And so the company's office have committed to develop beneficial owner register so that they can look through the companies and entities, their legal definition through to the beneficial definition. We have not done enough work there, as one example. And that's just focused action. So the fact that we are now placed on increased surveillance is in fact a good thing, because it now is another force that focuses us to do what we have to do. In the case of SARS, we recognize that we are interdependent. And so what we have done is we've set up very focused teams with the ID, the Independent Directorate in the NPA. In fact, they are located right next to our building. We had a vacancy and we invited Shamila Batoy to occupy that so that we actually have a seamless ability for teams to quickly sit and talk together under the laws provided for the exchange of information between us. And I think we've seen a lot of momentum gained in terms of that. We have taken the head of our criminal investigation and partnered her with the head of tax within the NPA task prosecution. They work together as a team. We identify common cases to improve our ability to prosecute. So, like most South Africans, I'm equally frustrated that things take so long. But I can tell you this as a fact, that where we are in 2023, we are significantly better off than where we were in 2019. In terms of the outstanding actions, we have reduced that list. The majority of those items, we now have 8 areas left. And I think in the next 12 to 24 months, if we don't deal with those, we only have ourselves to blame. The impact of grey listing, I think, for the financial institutions, I believe, apart from the initial knee-jerk reaction, will very quickly, because financial markets have this intuitive or herd response. I don't know which is, if it's more intuition or more herd responses, to react. And then you normalize again. So I think the bigger damage for us is the reputational risk rather than the actual fundamental risk that we face. And I think now we have to step up and deal with those issues.
And while we're on the subject of hot button topics, what was not mentioned in the Commissioner's CV is that he's a former Eskom power station manager who spent a long time at Eskom back in the day, back in the good old days, and is now on the President's Advisory Committee. So, Commissioner, what are our chances of ending load shedding by the end of this year?
Do you have nothing stronger for this bottle? You know, again, we are our own worst enemies in this regard. We didn't wake up one morning and find that our power stations weren't working. Eskom in 2000, at the turn of the millennium, was a globally admired utility. When I joined, we were an average utility. So I am proud to say that we were the generation of leaders that turned Eskom from an average performing utility into a world-class utility. So I think I speak with a little bit of direct experience of how that turnaround can take place. I think the other issue I want to say very bluntly, Hilary, and the media should help us with this as well, is that we tend in South Africa to take a very binary position. And sadly in South Africa, along political and race lines. So most of you in the room are probably anti-government or pro-government and anti-Eskom and Deloitte or pro-Eskom and Deloitte. Rather than just zooming out and say, there are actually culpabilities on both sides. Okay? There are things government ought to and should be held accountable for having done better. And I can go through a long list of what those are, including often policy unclarity and just focus in terms of understanding what our energy mix and transition should look like. And on the Eskom side, there are definitely things they could have done better in terms of maintaining the plant. This most significant component of our 48,000 installed capacity is still dependent on coal. We're not going to wish coal away. In fact, we are now exporting coal to first world countries that tell us we shouldn't be using coal. That's the selective morality we find ourselves in the world. So we have to understand that we're still going to be reliant on coal for a long time, whilst we have a very clear and structured approach to the just energy transition. but focus on the word just in the transition. If it leaves more people in energy poverty, if it leaves more people without work, if it impacts the economy, the transition isn't just. And I think the lack and the joint culpability, and I say this unapologetically, is we needed a more coherent plan of action between Eskom and government, and that was missing. Secondly, to make the broad claim that the power stations are old and therefore you cannot expect it to perform. Imagine you're a young power station manager struggling out at Matla. By the way, that was my first big power station. And I can tell you nice stories about what we did there. But imagine you're a young power station struggling to keep the boilers on, to keep the turbines on. And you hear your leadership saying, you shouldn't expect these plants to perform any better because they are old. How does that inspire you? How does that inspire you? To bust your guts. And I know what it is to be a young power station manager. And to get out at 2 o'clock and to drive and to get into a boiler and to go and find out what the contractors are doing and why it's taking 7 days to repair a boiler tube leak. To leave your family behind in the middle of winter, driving those dangerous roads through Witbank towards the power station. I know how you need to lift yourself up. Now you hear the leadership saying is, don't expect any better. That was a fundamental, flawed narrative. And I say that unapologetically, even to those who criticize me that I'm out of my lane. I understand that lane. I lived in that lane. How do you explain Kusile, a brand new power station manager, struggling to perform at 50% EAF? Many of the problems, and I visited Kusile. How do you explain that the coal contract isn't in place and you're getting coal from 6 or 8 different mines, and then you expect that boilers are designed to work on a very tight coal spec? How do you provide a good quality spec if you don't even know where your coal is coming and half of it is replaced by thugs who put rocks under the coal? How do you explain that at Kusile, the ash conveyor belt ends up in the middle of the field? No one thought to build a conveyor belt between the end of the ash line and the ash dam where it should be disposed of. How do you explain that? So I'm afraid that the focus on plant performance, the discipline of what excellence looks like, walking on a power station floor to see basic hygiene not in place, doesn't require money, it requires focus. And so I'm sorry, I will stay with the narrative that Eskom could have done better, even with the existing plant, to improve. How do you run power stations at a level, a well-performing, newer power station should easily run at 90% availability, not at 47%. So, and the sadness in South Africa is that you choose a side and you stick to the side. I would invite you to zoom out, be more balanced in your approach, and understand where government messed up, and they did, and where Eskom management messed up, and they did.
Powerful stuff, so to speak. And I suspect that the audience would actually like us to carry on along those lines, because I think load shedding is top of everyone's mind. But I'm going to take it back to revenue.
By the way, your newspaper should tell me what facts I got wrong.
This is not me personally, this is between the commissioner and my newspaper. Last question. I've been
just had to get that in there.
I knew you would get that in. Last question, because we need to wrap. You talked about your achievements in achieving and, in fact, exceeding the target for this year. But the commissioners, the finance minister has set you an even more demanding target for the coming year. As I understand the budget documents, if you kind of increased revenue by 7.5 last year, your target for this year is to increase it again by 8 point something to 1.9 trillion rand. How do you rate your chances of achieving that? And what are you going to do in an economy which is really tanking to get us there?
So first of all, it's not a target, it's an estimate. The official term is a revenue estimate, and it's based on modeling and that the tax and the economic policy and treasury work together with the Reserve Bank and the SARS. So it's modeled on assumptions. If those assumptions don't bear out, then obviously it impacts on the revenue performance. That's the first point. You know, South Africa is the only country so obsessed with revenue targets. In most other countries, it's not even doesn't even make the evening news. But anyway, South Africa is such a wonderful place. And I come back to the point, Hilary, I said that in South Africa, for us now, within the bad news is our good news. And the confidence that we draw from, or the evidence we draw from to give us confidence that for a few more years there will be a compliance dividend is in fact that we know that not every taxpayer who should be on the register is on the register. Just this year, we will have grown our register by another just over 1 million. Not all of them contributing, because sadly companies make people come and register for tax even before they apply for a job. But the register will have added another 5 billion additional revenue that wouldn't have been there, mainly tax and VAT, income tax and VAT for individuals. So as SARS becomes more effective and efficient and improves the compliance culture and the compliance index, we believe that the lowest hanging fruit is in fact there. Now, over time, that opportunity will decrease, but what you need to really watch is not SARS's performance against the revenue estimate, because that's just based on a model. What you really have to watch is SARS's revenue performance against the economic performance. And as long as, so our ambition is to always retain a buoyancy of 1, but it also is flawed in the sense that there isn't a time congruence between tax liability and revenue collected because of the time lag. And also some of it is outstanding debt that's more than a year old. And so we believe that the real indicator to watch is tax buoyancy, and obviously also tax to GDP ratio. And we believe that as we improve the administrative capability of SARS, we should set ourselves a target of at least a tax revenue collection equal to the rate at which the economy is growing.
Commissioner, thank you very much. Itireleng, thank you very much for joining us. Sadly, we have run out of time, but I understand the audience will have an opportunity to put some questions to the panel later on. So thank you, and on to the next session.
Thank you very much for that. It's always wonderful listening to these guys who've got some training in electricity and engineering, and talk about ESCOM. It's always an interesting one, talking about binaries, and you know, these MBAs come and they tell us how the world works, and now we have an MBA and somebody with training in engineering. And I'm told, growing up in Cape Town, he said he wanted to be CEO of ESCOM. Don't know what's changed, when, and how. Maybe I misread it, maybe I'm misquoting Trevor Manuel, or I'm misquoting somebody else, but Commissioner, there's a vacancy there, and I hear as well. That applies to you, Hilary Joffe, as well.
Last week I got an SMS from the ESCOM pension fund to tell me that the party they're planning has been moved to the 6th of April. So I'm going to that party.
I see. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the engaging panel driven by Hilary Joffe. Hilary is really peerless when it comes to economics and fiscal issues in the coverage in the media. Let's take a few minutes break, 2 minutes, literally.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for making time again to join us after your quick break and refreshments. And I must say, I'm grateful that you've all had an opportunity just to unwind a little bit. My name is Kukulethu Mfuti, and I work in the media. So as the Commissioner mentioned, sometimes we try our best to get it right with the likes of Hilary Joffe. But it's my pleasure to be moderating this conversation that proves to be very pertinent to the time, environment, and the climate that we find ourselves in as an economy. This will be an hour-long panel discussion, about 40 to 45 minutes. We will try to keep it quite prompt and tight, as we do look to offer you an opportunity as members of our audience and those who are joining us online to share and submit many of your questions, and of course probe our panelists who will be guiding us through critical themes that we all consider to be top of mind. And I think walking in this morning, one of the first comments I said to a few of the colleagues that I met was, what a week. You wake up, it's the budget speech. You wake up, it's news about the energy crisis, which is ongoing in South Africa. Then we find out that there's a leadership deficit with immediate effect. And then you wake up to the grey listing, and all of this compounds the already difficult environment that we find ourselves in South Africa. And this does set the theme and the tone and the context of the conversation and some of the nuggets that we hope to extrapolate from this conversation here today. So we'll certainly focus on the fiscal environment in South Africa. We'll translate that into getting clarity regarding the energy crisis that we continue to experience, how this in itself is inhibiting and hampering business confidence and, of course, ongoing investment that we require in our local environment. And most importantly, some solutions as to what do we do now. We're about a year away from an election that will take place in South Africa. And of course, there are critical aspects and elements that do speak to the sustainability of the businesses that we need to drive. So allow me to introduce my panelists who will be joining us in conversation today, and of course, responding to some of the realities that many of us do face on the ground. Starting to my right-hand side, Dr. Mampo Modise, who joins us as the Deputy Director General for Public Finance at National Treasury here in South Africa, followed by Dr. Thabi Leoka, who's an economist. The rose amongst other roses is Professor Mcebisi Njejana, who's a political commentator. And of course, towards the end of the panel is Joe Mitchell-Murray, who serves as Deloitte Africa turnaround and restructuring leader. So given the titles of our speakers here today, you can tell that these are all individuals who will be able to offer the critical level of insight that we require. And as I was listening to the Commissioner engage with Hillary just a moment ago, I took a moment to step back and look at the mood and the atmosphere in the room. And I commented to the panelists earlier on that we are slouched up, our jaws are clenched, we feel really uncomfortable, and we're stiff. And it's an adequate reflection of how we feel about the mood in the country right now. But that's just based on my assumption. What I'm going to do is break the rules slightly and offer you an opportunity as members of our audience, without a microphone, just to describe the sentiment of the country at the moment so that we fully understand and extrapolate the kind of answers that you're looking to hear today. So anyone tense, uneasy, not confident, frustrated? Are you still resilient? Hungry, tired. No doubt. And I think that's a fair reflection of how we do truly feel in South Africa and really speaks to how best we should be addressing some of the concerns that we have in our country. I would start typically with National Treasury, but I think let's hear from the other panelists just to give us their quick synopsis and a bird's eye view. The last week, as you've engaged with a number of peers, colleagues in the boardroom, around the braai, Joe, I'm keen to understand how you typically describe the current environment in South Africa at the moment from a business point of view.
Thanks, Gugu, and good morning to everybody, clients, colleagues, and guests. The last week has been, as you have mentioned, quite traumatic. But it's not just the events of the last week, which really play on our psyche as business. It's been the events of the last few years. Mm-hmm. Most recently, we have conducted a restructuring survey at Deloitte, where we asked restructuring professionals who typically have a glass half empty view of the world, what their sentiment was towards growth in the economy over the ensuing 12 months. And 81% said that they felt pessimistic or very pessimistic. 81%. Oh. Then, that was prior to last week where we had tested that sentiment. And then you have the events of last week and what that does. And as I said to you shortly before, I just feel that there is a sense of sort of some post-traumatic stress disorder amongst us. It is survival. And when we look at business is quite a broad term. It's made up of very large businesses who typically have a larger balance sheet, can be more resilient. And that's a word I think we've heard far too much in the last few years. You take it down a notch to businesses that are perhaps more in your micro, small, and medium sector. And there it really is about day-to-day survival. And, the energy crisis, which our Honourable Minister himself said is one of the biggest threats to survival of business and the largest economic constraint, growth, really does impact on what is available for them to survive month to month. So I think it is dire. Thank you.
Fair reflection. Prof, maybe we can come to you if you can give us an observation, especially from a political point of view, because whether you look at national leadership or even municipalities, there appears again to be just this uneasiness and high sense of anxiety that we're experiencing regarding the country right now.
There's no sense of direction in a way. So Cyril Ramaphosa came in promising to do things in a particular way, to bring the private sector on board, to clear certain obstacles.
We had a name for it, remember? Ramaphoria.
Ramaphoria, yes. Yeah. And what we've had is a lot of excuses, a lot of people being put into certain positions to do certain things, but they take long, for instance, to do things. You look at local government, for instance, where there isn't enough revenue to do basic things. You don't have sufficient staff, there are potholes. For instance, councillors are not doing what they're meant to do. They're not doing kind of monitoring to make sure that things are done. There is no electricity. So you have companies that are literally leaving small towns for other places because there's no certainty. So this means there's no revenue in these small places. So you have poor capacity, poor political leadership, no money to put into all sorts of things, because generally you don't have a sense of direction. There's no one pushing, kind of commanding what has got to be done. And there's no respect for merit, for instance. You still have people being appointed into certain positions simply because of who they know, of what their gravitas is, for instance. So I'm feeling a lot more despondent that we are not what we were promised, what we thought would happen, has turned out to be some kind of a mirage. We haven't held this president to account. I think we accepted a lot of things that he said, that he came from the private sector, he had this reputation. So we thought he would do certain things very easily. He would work, for instance, with business. But we are now finding out that he works within a certain bureaucracy that requires pushing a lot harder.
Sure.
And he's not the kind of president to push from the front. He just doesn't have the courage to do that. He waits and sees where everybody goes, and when it's safe, he then goes. For a country in a crisis like ours, you need someone who will stare you right in the face and said, you must do this or else I'm going to fire you. So we talk about this cabinet reshuffle, we're getting all excited about it. I'm not excited about it because it's not about merit. The reason why, for instance, you have this electricity minister being brought in is because he can't fire both chaps in the cabinet.
Sure.
Praveen and Kwaje. These are big guys in the cabinet. He really relies on them. And so this new minister, is he going to be a big guy, a strong guy? Is he going to push these two guys? Because if he is a junior, then he won't achieve much himself. You see, so we are back to square one.
Certainly. We'll come back to Eskom and those dynamics that you've unpacked in just a moment. Javi, I'm keen to get your opening remarks on the dynamics in the country at the moment. And you really have had a bird's eye view, right? And revolved in the many roles and functions of society to share a very honest reflection.
Yeah, I'm actually enjoying this period in a very warped way because I think that we are now speaking in unison. I think, and corporate, the poor, the wealthy, all people from all walks of life are now in agreement that we are in the pit. And what we haven't agreed on is how to get ourselves out of the pit, but we are in the pit. And for an economist, we've seen this. We've seen this in the numbers. For instance, South Africa's GDP from 2010 to 2020 was 1% on average. And we talk about employment and all these YES programs, et cetera, you cannot employ people when your economy is growing at 1%.
Yep.
Even the NDP said that we need to grow on average 5% to chip into that high unemployment
I
numbers.
must say, I smile as you reference the NDP because there has been no reference of the NDP
in years.
Exactly.
So that just shows you our priorities as well. Now you move that to the next 5 years, so 2015 to 2025, considering forecasts from analysts and even from the Reserve Bank, that number is below 1%, as in the average growth rate for the next 10 years from 2015 to 2025 is less than 1%. And we have a growing unemployment rate, and especially youth unemployment rate. Mm-hmm. And then if you look at what Status A figures show, that South Africans between the age of 17 and 14 go to school in the same way as comparably to the rest of the world. Beyond that, and before that, so anything before 7, we're actually lagging, and beyond that, we're lagging.
Sure.
And we also have a lot of older people going to, spending a lot more time at university and even high school, more so than other students in other countries. So the data tells us that we're underperforming. Never mind the everyday noise that confirms how weak we are as a state. Exactly. And what my fellow colleagues have said in terms of pointing out where the cracks are. So I'm not very optimistic. I haven't been. And I think that, in 2015, I wrote a 100-page thematic. I was fortunate in between the whole state capture. I didn't know anything about it at that time, but I spent some time at Eskom, and I wrote a 100-page thematic on Eskom. And I spoke to the most brilliant engineers, and they gave me a whole insight of what is going on. And the title of my thematic was South Africa's growth. South Africa cannot grow if Eskom is in its current state. And that was in 2015. And so, you look at, I read that thematic, nothing much has changed. Actually, a lot has deteriorated. So we're not working, there's no urgency or sense of urgency. I don't think we have the right people to deal with the problems that we have, especially at the political level. Gotcha. I think we have amazing South Africans who can solve these problems. I don't think these problems are unsurmountable. I just think that these problems are not are sitting at the wrong hands, and with people who don't have either right intentions or right capacity and capability to deal with them.
Got you. I'm not too sure how many of you might echo some of the sentiments that have been shared here by our panelists, because it does certainly describe a number of aspects that we need to touch on. The politics of the day, our people, where our demographic dividend is proving to be a youth bulge instead. Of course, profits coming under pressure for business, and productivity, which goes back to Eskom. Speaking of Eskom, Dr. Modise, I know that you have a tough job in your particular department, and it's not that you are ignorant to the themes that have been brought up by several of our panelists. If anything, you, together with your peers and colleagues at National Treasury, try your best to actually address these through the NDP, through Operation Vulindlela, through the Economic Recovery Plan. But the truth is that South Africans, as you've heard, are frustrated. And maybe let's talk about the rising debt burden that we experience in South Africa, primarily based on the additional allocation of resources to Eskom, which is an entity itself which, again, has proven to be underperforming. I'll put it politely.
I'm not holding this because there's answers. Sure. I'm just holding it because when you get tens, then people don't see that you tens when you're holding a book. I think one just needs to explain the difficulty of the budget. In an economy where difficult decisions are not made, the budget becomes the decision maker. So when we looked at what needs to be done, the question was, can we do whatever we can do within the budget? Now, personally, one can have a lot of opinions on how to resolve something. But when you look at the collective, the biggest question is, can the budget absorb what needs to be done to assist in resolving a problem? Now, I mean, in the book, we have several conditions that are there, but if you look at all of them, we have close to 40 even operational conditions. And this is to try and protect the use of the funds, the use of the taxpayers to try and resolve this problem.
Got you.
What is also key is when we were busy thinking about this and logically trying to see how we can resolve this problem, we then had to think about, are there other things in the system that we can do to solve the problem? But the problem is
The
whatever
problem being
you...
ESCOM, to be clear.
Yes, the energy problem. So you can't look at it as just one issue resolving ESCOM. You have to look at, are there other things that you can do as National Treasury or through the budget to look at the entire energy sector. Then what you then have to go and fight for or fight about is whatever solutions you have, what do they mean for the survival of ESCOM? If you have incentives, if you encourage people to get off the grid, what does that mean for the future ESCOM? Then you have other problems which are municipal debt. How do you deal with those? So all in all, the package for ESCOM is 1 year taking over the debt. But secondly, how do we then resolve the rest of the problems that are going to make this one problem become as small as possible, if that's going to be the case?
And maybe if I can jump in, Dave, you can take us into your conference, because under your portfolio, you also take care of financial monitoring and evaluation. And many might say, well, we've monitored and evaluated the performance of ESCOM over the years, coupled with other SOEs, and they're not matching up to some of the objectives that actually allow for them to receive this financial support. Since your appointment in 2017, what's the trend been like? And maybe respond to some of the South Africans who might be frustrated, saying, well, the results prove for themselves that we shouldn't be plowing more capital there.
I should have had tea first. Okay.
Rearrange.
Okay. So the system, the way it was designed, the state-owned companies were designed to provide a service to the people that cannot be provided by the private sector, or it would have been expensive. What we didn't take into consideration was their ability to provide that service. And what we didn't put in place is what then happens if that service cannot be provided. So we don't have mechanisms in place that will quickly change the structure of these entities. What we have been trying to do is to try and save entities, but not looking at the other alternatives beyond this particular entity. So what we are trying to do now, which for most of these entities might be late, is how do we bring in the private sector to play a bigger role in the space and make these entities smaller and provide the services for what they were intended to do, but in a smaller scale, rather than us trying to save them as big as they are, but not being able to provide the services that they need to provide. But it's not an easy task, because basically the moment when you bring in the private sector, the pushback that you're going to have is you privatizing the state-owned companies, which is right now, that might be what we need to get ourselves out of these problems that we face with several of our state-owned companies.
I'm hearing yes from a few of the audience members here. And maybe we can build up on that just in terms of incentives as well as additional support. And I'm happy to open up this to the rest of the panels, Tadia, and maybe yourself, Prof, just in terms of fully identifying and covering the kind of incentives and push that we do have to prioritize when it comes to addressing the energy challenge in South Africa. Are there some suggestions or recommendations and considerations that could be shared with National Treasury that they might become open to consider at the moment?
So let me jump in there. So I think we've exhausted the recommendations. The recommendations are there. It's just like it's like our reform policies. We know exactly what we need to do. For instance, a few years ago, we decided that we're going to dismantle ESCOM into 3 entities, right? And we all thought it was a great idea, cost effective. You then relieve the state's balance sheet. You go into private-public partnerships. And that was topical when it was initially an idea that was planted. And then it kind of fizzled away. And then no one really spoke about it. Even when, the SONA didn't really touch up on how we're going to dismantle it and what is the process. So we've got these great ideas, but they're not followed through by legislation and implementation of it. So they're just stuck there as ideas. So even some of the conditions that were put in there, and when you read the budget review, they're great ideas too, even especially concerning ESCOM. My concern with ESCOM right now is that you have uploaded its debt, but you don't have the implementers there, both in the state and even at ESCOM.
operational efficiency.
Who are we going to trust to ensure that Eskom's debt doesn't go back to where it was? Because there is no GM generation, there's no CEO, there is no COO, and people are leaving, and not just even at executive level, but a lot of young engineers are leaving and going elsewhere. So again, Treasury has done what it needs to do, but it can only go thus far.
Yep.
The implementation part of it, and this is what I tell ministers during our the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, because they sit there too, is fiscal policy should be treated as a verb. It's not Treasury's role. Treasury's role is to allocate resources effectively and make sure that actually there's no leakages and it's allocated in a way that is reasonable. The ministers in charge and the departments are the ones that actually implement fiscal policy. So without the implementation of fiscal policy, you're stuck. And that's where we are stuck in many of our, SOEs not working, 100%. And there's no efficiency in the system because there's no implementation.
And that takes us back to the overriding theme of political will, which often comes up, right? Prof, you
well, we need to keep our coal. We have lots of coal, as Ed was saying.
Yep.
We need that, and also because we get electricity, 80% of our electricity from coal. So we can't get rid of this resource that we have so much of, because to transition requires a lot of money. So let's exhaust what we have, move slowly towards the other side, and not follow other people's pace. We need to move in.
Despite the international commitments that have been made?
We are not really responsible for all these emissions, for lots of them at least.
Yeah.
Even, these European countries, look at Germany, they destroyed the whole village just to build a coal mine. And they are taking a lot of our coal. So they have decided that they can only transition depending if they have security of other sources of energy. And so we have to look at our own situation. What do we have? How much resources do we have to move forward? And so we move at that pace. We might perhaps not open up new mines, coal mines, but use what we have and move slowly on to the other side. The point about this is that we can't let other countries determine what we ought to do, when in fact they're doing the opposite of what they are saying.
100%.
So we've got to be in charge of this transition.
100%. As you say, being in charge of this transition, potential ongoing support and partnership with the private sector, and of course, going beyond the recommendations and actually implementing the right support. Joe, this is where I want to come to you. Whenever we talk about the private sector and its participation, it's often met with a lot of dread from some sectors of society who think that, again, it's privatizing all specific entities. But maybe we also need to talk about the level of private sector participation in its engagement with government. And I'm keen to hear from you on the back of the grey listing, on the back of what we've seen regarding the Zondo Commission and many other reports, the appetite and, of course, the flexibility and perhaps lack of reduction in red tape in doing business with government. What's the sentiment like, and are we seeing from your overview and portfolio that there are either increasing opportunities of public partnerships and their performance, really?
Gugu, I think, and especially just reflecting over the last few months, we are seeing a lot of willingness from the private sector to participate. There is a lot to bring to the party. And certainly when you look at the response of, BLSA and BUSA, that for me really demonstrates that willingness to want to contribute to all of the problems that we face. I suppose, when you take a step back and what is driving the reticence towards that, when there is so much to bring to the party, that's something I would like to unpack a bit more, because I think when we really try to understand what that is, that might help solve the problem, and it needs collaboration, it needs cooperation, it needs discussion to really drive that forward. I think particularly when we look at Eskom, and I really echo what you say, Dr. Tabi, it's not just about, fixing one part of the problem. It has to be a holistic solution. And that can't just lie with, government to solve.
Yeah.
It relies on business to also come to the party, to be a part of those conversations to really fix it from a more holistic perspective. You know, when I listen to Prof speak, again, when we look at distressed, or as you termed underperforming businesses, that ESG is reversed. It's GSE. It's a focus on governance, then social aspects. Then we can deal with the environmental aspects, which speaks to coal. So I really do believe that there is a lot that the private sector can bring to the conversation. It's getting a seat at the table and that spirit of collaboration and listening.
Quick question is, will they come on board on the back of the grey listing, especially maybe in relation to a number of the international partners that you work with?
I would absolutely hope so. I mean, the grey listing, I don't know that I quite feel as positive as the commissioner. I have a bit more trepidation. I think the consequences of that are not yet fully understood. And so it will require business again to come to the party to really, I suppose, properly understand what that means for us and how do we resolve it. The capital flight that is, I suppose, mentioned, and that comes with some, I suppose, sort of, you know, it's said to evoke emotion, you know, it's capital flight. Have we seen it? Do markets correct in terms of that herd mentality, or that intuitive correction remains to be seen? I think there, as I say, I'm not sure the consequences are fully understood, and we need to get together, join hands to understand that properly.
Maybe Dr. Modise, I can throw this back to you. We have heard that there have been ongoing engagements between National Treasury and FATF, but maybe you can take us into your conference into further understanding how best we're looking to source solutions to address this concern. And of course, working very closely with the National Prosecuting Authority as well.
Yes, so what we need to do is to implement what we said we're going to implement. So in the budget, firstly, we allocated money just to capitalize the entities that are critical to fight this. But just one thing to say is that this shouldn't, us resolving crime shouldn't be because of FATF. That should be something that we strive to do in any event. But we did allocate funding for this, and when we were doing the growth estimates, we also took it into consideration on what this means, because of course you can't really know the impact now, but you have to plan for it. So what we have been doing now, with Momo leading the team, of course, is to try and resolve the 8 outstanding issues. And from those 8 outstanding issues, how can we possibly resolve them as fast as possible? What do we need from the different entities? Are there other things that Treasury can do to assist them in trying to fast track the resolution of those 8 issues?
100%. We will continue with a few themes that we do want to unpack, especially looking at social grant support, businesses' concerns and response, and hopefully some kind of increase in the incentives that have been provided from a solar and renewable energy point of view. But we do want to, as audience members, if there are any questions that you have for us in person, or those of you online, please make sure that you type them into the chat or Q&A service. We will be able to pick them up. And those of you in the audience, if you do have any questions, the roving mic is available. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So please do raise your hand up quite high, keep it brief and succinct, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So as you, Sim, and I see one hand up so far, so if you can keep it up just to make it easy for my colleagues to identify you, and any other follow-up hands will come to you in just a moment too. But I do also want us to address very briefly another concern that we often don't tend to focus on enough in South Africa is the concern about the dwindling tax base. And I look at the Commissioner because he's been very clear that that's not the case. But of course, there's been a lot of alarm and concern about the increase in social grant support and spending that we offer in South Africa. Many critics have said this is a ticking time bomb. Others have said, hold on, there'll always be vulnerable members of our community and we need to correct this before we actually find them participating in looting or further activities of great concern. Let's touch on it very briefly, just in terms of South Africa's positioning, how we need to manage this particular tightrope from National Treasury, and of course what this might mean for the electorate next year. Prof, if you can indulge us. But Tabi, go ahead.
So I think both are right, that there are vulnerable people in South Africa that need assistance, but at the same time, I have huge issues in how we glorify 18 million people who are reliant on social grants, and also a further 7 million South Africans that rely on the social, the SDR, the distress relief, 315, that has now been increased. That means that you have 25 million South Africans who are reliant on the state. I think a successful government is one that goes out to say, actually, we had 18 million or we had 25 million, and this year we have 20. So less 5 million that have been reliant on the state, because we have these programs that have been able to rehabilitate, train people, and these people are now self-reliant and can stand on their own. But we do the opposite. And we do the opposite in a country that doesn't have the resources, as Mampo has put it, and everybody knows that we don't have a tap that just flows with money. And just to show you just the numbers, we are a 4.6 trillion rand country. We have a debt for 2022-23 that is 4.7 trillion.
Going to increase.
So now imagine that, how, I know we're very smart people in this room, but when I talk to people, I say, imagine that's your household, your income versus your expenditure. And that means you have nothing left. But then Mampo and team have told us that next year, our debt is going to be, when we consider ESCOM, it's actually going to be just under 6 trillion. Again, going back to, we have a 4.6 or 4.7 trillion rand economy. And our debt next year for the world, 2024-25, is going to be just under 6 trillion, 5.8. We were living above our means. And then another question I have for South Africans too, to ask the government, in 2008, our debt stock, our government debt was 500 and odd billion, not trillion, billion rands, 500 odd billion rands, just a little over what ESCOM's debt was before the debt relief. Now, a few years later, the debt is 5.8 trillion, just under 6 trillion rand.
Sure.
So I ask people, why don't you ask the government, what has it done? How did it accumulate all that money when actually there's been decay in infrastructure? There hasn't really been much in social upliftment. There's just been a lot of wastage, and a significant amount of wastage, to the extent that actually our debt servicing costs is as high as it.
Exactly. We'll give you an opportunity to respond to that, Dr. Modise, but Prof, let's come to you in a moment. Then we've noted the question.
We need to take care of these folks. About 50% of these households live in poverty. 50%. You have 70% youth unemployment. This is a very dangerous situation. These are people who are vulnerable to all sorts of populism, because they are not included in the system. So they need to be taken care of, especially because they don't have, some of them might not have kids, no home, so they don't feel that they have anything to kind of protect, so they don't give a damn. And so they are easy to entice them into all sorts of things that are anti-society, because they're not benefiting from this society. So we need to dilute the brutality of their unemployment.
Are the social grants enough, though? Because we can all fast track or rewind to 2021 July.
I think we do want to give them jobs. For instance, there's a reason why they are not getting basic grants, for instance, because government has been saying that they have to be kind of self-reliant. They have to get jobs. The problem is that they're not getting jobs. Unfortunately, we are where we are. It's either you let them starve and you face huge implosion later on, or you deal with this delicate situation up until you have some solutions to create serious jobs. So it's a delicate balancing act, unfortunately, that we have to do.
What if others might say, well, no allocation to NHI or no mention of NHI, even though there's about 23 billion that's been allocated to health? Are there other ways within which we could actually look to develop our communities? Maybe you can respond to the NHI concern, and of course, as we've heard from Tabi, why there is just no progress, and if National Treasury is working with other departments to monitor and adequately evaluate their performance.
So in 2019, we finalized the financing paper on NHI. And basically, the National Treasury proposals was, before we even look at additional allocation, fix the system that you have. Use the resources that you have and make sure that the system is ready for you to transition into NHI. And the allocations, the way in which we propose is that there will be over time, but we have to look at whether you're doing what you're supposed to do for us to give additional funding. So it's not that the discussion is not there, but the department itself has to be prepared and ready to implement anytime. We have allocated money for pirating anytime, and unfortunately, most of the money was underspent because of the lack of readiness of the department. But now we moved, so COVID also didn't help because the focus then moved or shifted to dealing with the COVID pandemic. But now we're starting the discussions again. But the modeling or the financing is not going to change.
Got you. Very briefly, the sustainability of social grants before we take a question.
I need to answer this politically correct. The design of the grant should be such that it bridges the gap for unemployment and not create dependency in the system. So the grant is required, for example, if a person just finishes school and they are transitioning into employment, we need to assist them as the state, but we can't create dependency.
Maybe Gugu, if I can also come in there, because it's something I feel quite passionately about, is that you have these 25 million who are in some way dependent. For me, the trick is making sure that that number does not increase. And so in as much as we are focused on job creation, we need to be focused on job preservation. And so the support for particularly small businesses, in my mind, is lacking, because it is the small business, that sort of MSME sector, which contributes to significant employment. And we have to ensure that those businesses maintain those jobs, that we're not growing the 25 million base whilst pursuing a growth agenda. And that for me is imperative.
100%. Interesting you mentioned that, because already there also concerns a big business, as you say, letting go of a particular staff. But as we continue to do, we try to ensure that preservation is still a priority. We've kept you waiting long enough, sir. You don't have a quick microphone? Perfect. You can go ahead with your question. And if there's another one, we'll come to the next one shortly after, wherever the next mic is. You can go ahead, sir.
Certainly, really addressed to you. You referenced the importance of bringing corporate South Africa on board, and just to have them at the table is critical. I think we all recognize that. How does one then reconcile the alleged comments by our Honourable President that business, quote, should stop shouting from the sideline? How does one reconcile your belief that we should get business around the table with the Honourable President's recent alleged comments?
Thank you for that. My belief is that business is not on the sidelines. Business is in the ring. We're there. We're fighting. And, it's very difficult to hear comments like that when you know just how hard business is working, and albeit not necessarily out in the open and, visibly. Business is absolutely pioneering, supporting what needs to happen in South Africa. So it is difficult to hear those comments, because it is not, in my experience, the case of what we're actually seeing. We're in the ring, we're fighting.
Got you. Happy to take another question. There's a hand at the back, or the mic is already at the back. No?
Thank you.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Gugu, can I just, there's a tendency to want to muzzle people, and it's been going on for a long time. So if business is shouting, it's frustrated, and let them shout because they are frustrated. I think if I was on the other side, I would listen to the frustration and meet business halfway. But then to criticize and say, look, there you are standing on the rooftops yelling, that's because actually business has had BUSA, BLSA, Business for South Africa. We've gone through all diplomatic channels. And right now we actually are just, it's fine to shout. Maybe we heard if we shout.
Valid point. Let's take two questions back to back. I've also been alerted that we're open to taking questions for the commissioner. So happy for you to throw those there to make sure that we can get through as many questions as possible. You can go ahead, Matt.
A small, very technical question about the budget.
Small question about, go ahead.
Yeah, there was this tax incentive for investing in solar and renewables. What I was wondering is why a tax incentive or tax relief that would only concern a small bracket of the population and not a VAT relief, which would, on those installations, that would then help so many more, even if they didn't like apply in those very small brackets. I'm not sure if that was clear enough.
100%. If you can respond, Dr. Modise, the dynamic between the solar incentive, which speaks to a smaller part of the audience or population versus that. Why not? What considerations, I guess, were taken into account?
The cost, the affordability. Could we afford giving that release? I don't think so. The complexity of the system, the way in which we're proposing to do it, it's less complicated, I hope, Commissioner. And as I said, how much will it cost the state, and can we afford what can we afford? Even to decide on the magnitude, it was also based on the cost, because we've been criticized that 25% is not enough, 15,000 top a cap is also not enough. But the thing is, if you give a release of this and you can't afford it, then you have to find it somewhere else. That defeats the purpose. So it was mainly based on funding and the administrative complexities that we had to take into consideration.
So this is a polite way of telling households. Sure, Commissioner, we'll give you an opportunity. Commissioner, you've got a mic, and then Joe will come to you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think what's important is a redistributive component to this. So on the one hand, you argue that it's only people who have money that can afford to benefit from the incentive, and that's technically correct. But the intent behind this is to make more people self-reliant, to take pressure off the grid. And what that then does is people in the townships and people who can't afford the incentives will then have access to the power that they need from the grid. So in some way, by taking wealthy people and people who can afford in businesses off the grid, you make more available for poor people who don't have the financial means to buy solar or to invest in an inverter and battery. So there is a redistributive component to that as well, plus the points that Dr. Modise made.
No prospects of the incentive increase in the cap?
In the cap?
The 50, 25%?
I think as Mampo quite rightly says, whatever you give back, you have to find somewhere else, because the minister's commitment to retain the primary surplus, to retain the fiscal stability, has to be taken into account when you add all the rands and cents on both sides of the P&L.
I tried, guys. I tried. I've been frustrated. So you had a comment, and then there was another question still on that side, and happy to take a few from this side of the room too.
Thanks, Gugu. I mean, I really understand the balancing act that has to take place, and I hear the intent. I suppose my concern is just the take-up on this, because if you look at it from a business perspective, it requires the balance sheet, it requires financing to be able to take advantage of the incentive, and you are waiting, a best case scenario, 16 to 17 months before you actually receive the benefit of that. If you look at it from an individual perspective, it's the same. You have to finance it before you actually reap the benefits of the incentive. When you look at it from a MSME perspective, and perhaps financing through the extension of the bounce back guarantee loan perspective, you have to look at how did that work with COVID. There wasn't great take-up in that. And that for me was twofold. One was load shedding, which I appreciate we're trying to solve here. But the other is the cost of that finance, and particularly in a rising interest rate economy. So I do feel that whilst good incentives, how much are they really going to make a difference when it is really strong, big business that will be able to take advantage of it, and affluent individuals only, because they have to wait for the incentive to kick in, and the poor uptake in terms of the bounce back guarantee loan system, because you are requiring those businesses to be bankable, and that is no mean feat. That requires a certain level of governance, of financial reporting, which we didn't see during COVID. And so I am concerned that we're going to see similar with this particular scheme, that the uptake is not going to be there.
Valid points, and hopefully we walk away with some solutions that we can implement in considerations to make the uptake a lot easier. Keen to squeeze in two more questions. I'm told we've got about 5 minutes. There's a question at the back, sir. Happy to take yours.
Good morning. This is to the DDG. So sadly, corruption is a pandemic as well in this country. So with the whole ESCOM debt relief, is the Treasury not concerned about this ultimately, as Tavi also said, ending in a negative prospect in terms of the money being used where it shouldn't. We have heard about the misappropriation of funds, the corruption basically around ESCOM. If this was a private company, the investors would have certain guidelines or points that need to be met before this kind of debt relief is given. So is there something along those lines from a treasury perspective for ESCOM, certain points that they need to meet with regard to this debt relief that has been put forward?
Certainly. So once money is appropriated, then Treasury has oversight. So we are planning to have as frequent meetings with ESCOM as possible with the team that will be overlooking ESCOM. We also contracted international guys to help us understand the problem in its entirety, look at what's available, the power stations and all of that. And the money is based on conditions that ESCOM implements most of these recommendations that are going to come out through that work. And the operational conditions that we have are aimed to try and minimize misuse of funds as possible. But there's so much you can do with conditions. I mean, we need law enforcement. The problem sometimes is that when people are corrupt, nothing gets done. We still need law enforcement to deal with corruption, but we do the best to get ESCOM's leadership to be accountable for the funding that we'll be providing to them.
100%. Some might argue that if it was a private entity, that's where Joe would have to come in, right? Through restructuring and maybe also monitoring potential liquidations there. We're happy to check if there's one more question before we get closing remarks from our audience members. I saw your hand up first, sir, and the microphone is with you, so happy to go ahead with your question. Any other questions that need to be directed, we're happy to participate at the end of the day, but your hand has been noticed. I've been encouraged to take your question too, sir. So we'll take them back to back. We're just going to try that one more time, just to make sure that your microphone is on. But we did hear that you are from the automotive industry.
Yes, so I just thought I should put that, should declare that up front. So my question is to Dr. Mutise and maybe the Commissioner. Obviously, from an industry perspective, we are facing a risk, from a manufacturing perspective of, for lack of a better word, extinction with regards to the introduction of new energy vehicles. And our expectations from the budget last week was that there will be some form of an announcement or a statement, especially from a treasury perspective, insofar as the direction of how the industry will be supported from the national purse perspective, if any. So I just want to ask a question: Is there that kind of thing? We know from a DTI perspective, we've had a lot of interactions, and there's a white paper is out. But from a treasury perspective, has there been any discussions or thinking around the transitioning South Africa's automotive sector to new energy vehicles? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, sir. Happy to take a response, as you did direct that both to National Treasury and perhaps the Commissioner, but happy for you to respond.
Yeah, it's like the just transition. There's a difference between acting and discussing. So I think we have had sufficient discussions that now it's time we make decisions on what we're going to do. So we have been discussing this with the DTIC, but the issue is, which sector do you support? Do you support the new sector? Do you support the old sector? How do you support the transition? So that is work that is still ongoing.
If I can add to that, I've actually had direct requests from one of the large automakers and have raised the point with both Minister of Finance and Minister of Trade and Industry and the DG. If we have to be self-critical, and I'm not as politically correct as my colleague, call things as I see them, I think we are behind the curve. I think we don't have a coherent policy in terms of where we're going to go with EV, and the risk that we face as a country is that train will leave the station and we'll have to play catch up again. We know that through the MDP, the motor development plan that we've had since the early 90s have yielded significant results for us. It has in fact made South Africa a production hub for the Southern Hemisphere. And now these mother companies are asking, where is South Africa going in terms of an EV, and we are not clear enough. So I certainly am a voice of saying we need greater urgency to get policy coherence and start communicating it. Otherwise, we will lose that. I mean, some of them are looking at where do they locate large battery manufacturing plants. And if South Africa is in forefront or clearer, then they'll choose another destination.
That's what we need to avoid, so ongoing engagement. Your hand was up, so if you could raise it up real high. Oh, you've got the mic. Happy to wrap it with you.
Is it on? Maybe look forward 14 months from now, we're voting. Give some scenarios around what that looks like and potential impact of coalitions. Interesting views.
Thank you so much. You save that for the prof. Good one.
It doesn't look good for the ANC. By next year, you will still have these outages. Life is just not good. Drinking cold beer, don't even watch your game, you are stuck in traffic. So happiness levels are extremely low. So you are looking at the ANC, for instance, the polls are saying the ANC will hit low 40s, the DA will be around 20, EFF will be around 10. So there'll be some kind of a partnership there, no outright winner. The question is, who is going to go into that partnership? Prospects are the ANC and the DA will kind of go together because the EFF promises disruptive politics. Whoever wants to get into bed with them has to make a lot of concessions that they might otherwise prefer not to make. And also because these two parties have similarities in terms of policy, and I think they also have common funders. Some of you want both of them. So there is a lot of pressure from the business sector, from funders, from common sense to have kind of moderate common sense politics. And that you will find certainly in the DA and the ANC.
Prof, if I can add to that before we start with concluding remarks from many of our panelists, we've seen how coalition governments unfold on the ground at a municipal level. Nationally, what does this mean for confidence and political stability?
Well, you have two big parties. They are very big, so they know that they have big prospects of growth. So they will behave, properly. Small parties, one-person party, they know they got lucky. 800 votes. So you don't know if we'll be around the next time around, right? So you hop into bed with one person, that person. That's the main key for this instability. Small parties, but big parties are more stable. They know that they can get more votes, so they will do things in a much more mature way.
I do want us to start with concluding remarks because there's been a lot to extrapolate from today's conversation, and of course many considerations that we don't have enough time to uncover fully. But as we leave here today, I'm hoping that we can walk away with tangible solutions. It's tough, it's difficult, it's uneasy, and it's going to be like this for a while, as has been evident from the conversation we've had today. But that doesn't mean that the dialogue needs to stop here or that solutions can't be sourced. Tabi, I'd like you to give us your perspective as an economist regarding the economic climate in South Africa, what it might mean for businesses as well as households. Joe, if we can come to you to get your perspective regarding business. Of course, they've been tough as well in terms of their level of resilience, but we also know that from Stats SA, their data from August last year, there's been a significant increase in the number of liquidations in the country, and that is of great concern. Perhaps share some of your thoughts there. And we'll close it off with yourself, Dr. Modise. Perhaps if you can just tie it in again, the commitments that have been made by National Treasury and perhaps as a government to no matter how difficult things are, but to continue on the path of fiscal consolidation and doing so adequately so by monitoring where our capital is allocated to. Tabi, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Gugu. So as I mentioned, growth is going to be feeble. You cannot grow this economy without
Should we start saying the R word, or is it too soon?
I don't think so, but it depends on the level or the stages of load shedding. Stage 6 is become the new norm. And we used to complain when we were at stage 2, and now we are happy to be at stage 4. And what concerns me is that we could possibly be at stage 8 and above, or that could be the new norm too in future. We were last week, I think Tuesday, we were on stage 7. So, and these stages mean deduct a lot. These are billions of rands that an economy loses on a daily basis. What concerns me too is that, you know, the economy is driven by sectors, and sectors are businesses, are composed by businesses. I'm concerned that, you know, when I see businesses reporting, and we don't really make too much of a noise about this, but I'll mention one company that recently reported that it spent, ShopRite spent R500 million on electricity generation. This is diesel. Never mind that it's a pollutant, which is another thing altogether. And not every company can go the solar route, by the way. Telecommunication operators cannot, because they use towers that are all over the country, and that's why communication is so interrupted when there's load shedding, prolonged load shedding, because the batteries need to be at 100%. And so what telecommunication operators are doing is that they're going to put generators at every tower, which also means, you know, Nigeria is the country with the biggest generators per capita, and we're going to be moving towards that direction. So it's not only pollution, it's noise pollution on top of that, and it's costly. We don't have the infrastructure like Nigeria, where we also have security around our generators, because people are stealing generators or diesel and petrol from generators. And another thing that also will stifle growth, especially from a company perspective, is that companies are utilizing their capital expenditure and reallocating that into electricity generation. Yeah. Capital expenditure is investment, and investment is employment. So basically, if a company that was sitting on cash doesn't want to expand, because firstly, it's, you know, they're not certain about the future of the country, but at the same time, they also cannot, because they are uncertain about electricity supply. So they're moving those allocations elsewhere. So we're not growing. And I feel like with everything that's going on, we are gridlocking the economy instead of opening it up and employing people. Everyone is looking internally to see how they can save themselves. And as much as Treasury and the government has announced that you can, you know, utilize the grid, and there could be private generation of electricity where private companies contribute to the grid, that is not happening currently. Sure. There's grid issues, there's transmission issues. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I agree with the Commissioner. We are very late in the whole energy game, and it's going to be costly.
Sure.
Sure.
Thanks, Gugu. I just want to go back again to the budget speech, where the Honourable Minister said the power crisis threatens the very survival of businesses. And you have referenced the liquidation statistics that came out from December last year, where, if I recall, there was about a 30% increase in the number of liquidations December 2022 compared to December 2021. And a liquidation is a lagging statistic. So we have not seen the consequence of this power crisis, which really ramped up in November, December last year, that we are going to see over the next 2 to 4 months, and what that means for the number of liquidations in our economy. We also need to be cognizant that for smaller businesses that may be a sole proprietorship or a partnership, liquidation is the only solution to financial distress. There is no second chance. There is no business rescue. That is only available to companies. But then I'd go a step further and say that is only available to companies who can afford it. It is not a cheap process. So what I do think we need is law reform, a more cost-effective out-of-court restructuring process for smaller businesses that give them a second chance, that really aid that job preservation, so you create stability. And it's with stability you can grow. What Papa said about looking forward 14 months, I read instability and uncertainty. And for me, from a business perspective, that makes it worse in terms of trying to survive. I think you mentioned cash preservation. Cash preservation, in terms of the survey we've run, #1 on the C-suite objectives of what they need to do. Last year, it was at the bottom.
So now they are holding on to cash because they know that they've got to finance what power issues, generator issues over this next period. So we're not seeing that reinvestment, that capex that enables growth. So I am quite concerned about what this next period holds for us.
Got you. Dr. Modise, we always talk about National Treasury walking a tightrope. I'm not even sure if it's still a rope or a strand right now.
Oh, imaginary.
Exactly. Or imaginary is what she said.
You know, after Minister presents the budget, we always feel, okay, now we are done. Then you come to platforms like this, then you realize you have a lot of work to do. So I shall be going back to Momo to explain to him the work that we have to do. I think the first thing that we don't do well, and it's something that we need to start considering, is how do we get participation before we publish the budget? So how do we get private sector views? How do we get independent views so that we take that into consideration? Because I think it will minimize the criticism when we table the budget. There's no point
to ask about NEDLAC, but you may continue.
No. So you include the NEDLAC process, but in NEDLAC you don't get to discuss the motor vehicle sector. You don't get to discuss different sectors. So even in the budget process itself, there's no harm in us meeting different industries just to try and understand their cries, you know. The second thing that we need to push for anything to happen in the state is the capacity of the state, and basically rationalizing all of these entities that we have that are draining the resources that we need. If we rationalize, then we won't be spending unnecessary resources to try and save entities that we shouldn't save. So that is something that we need to finalize. Minister talked about it, but I think we have to now push for it as the Treasury. There's a lot of issues that we keep on talking about, but we don't push, and that one of them is infrastructure spending. That is something that we need to kickstart the growth, but we don't spend enough. If you look at the underspending numbers, most of those come from infrastructure. So from a Treasury point of view, we need to finalize the procurement bill because that will enable the government to procure easier. So we need to finish that process so that we don't see the underspending that we're seeing currently. And I think what is key in ensuring sustainability of our finances is if we have conditions and we put conditions for SOCs, we shouldn't later on feel sorry for them and sort of say, yeah, you achieve 8 out of 15, we give you half the money. If you don't achieve or adhere these conditions, you shouldn't get funding. And we shouldn't be scared as the state to basically, if you don't achieve, we close you down and that's it.
Yeah. Looking forward to seeing how all of these themes do develop, and of course, maybe even you being appointed as Minister of Finance to ensure that you implement these policies beyond just suggesting. But really a point appreciated.
No, since they don't earn money, I'm looking for money. I've served, I've done my dues.
You served your dues. So yes, anyone in the public sector, in the private sector, clearly there's an opportunity here. But I think more than anything, we've really tried to provide some clarity and perspective, right? And you might still feel disheartened and discouraged. But more than anything, I think once you fully understand the reality of the environment that you're operating in, it makes it a lot clearer for you to fully understand what it is that you need to do, how you need to implement it, how quickly to do so, and who to partner with. The fundamentals that call for South Africans to be resilient and, of course, collaborate in order to see us transition into a more vibrant economy are still required. So buckle up. The next 14 months will definitely be a lot more difficult, but it's through the ongoing partnership and these open discussions that we are able to find ways to source solutions. So on that note, I'd like to thank all of my panelists for being honest and robust, and most importantly, also giving us some clarity about the environment that we operate in, and hopefully walking away with some feedback that we can all implement in the different spaces that we work in, to come back and hopefully share a very different story in about 24 months' time. On that note, I'd like to welcome Itireleng back onto stage. We've kept you here for 15 minutes longer than what we should, but if you could just help us with the closing remarks as well as thanks for today.
Thank you so much, Gugulethu. I don't think anybody could have done such an excellent job of moderating this discussion. I thank you so much, our panel, for your honest reflections and insights and thought-provoking discussion that we had today. I think I agree with Dr. Tabilioka when she says that the good thing about all this is that we find you all on the same page. We all agree that we've got problems, we've got challenges, And hopefully that means we'll get together and get to the table and actually start discussing solutions instead of arguing of whether we've got problems or not. Commissioner, thank you so much. I'd like to give you an opportunity to give your closing remarks, please, in 1 minute.
Thank you. I think, first of all, we are in violent agreement. We understand the problem. I agree, I can't conflict or differ with any of what you've said. But I do think we need a few things that we need to do differently. First of all, we have to get beyond our us and them discourse. South Africans are notoriously bad at that. This is our country. We want to make sure that we are as inclusive, and don't wait for an invitation. Break the door down and let your voice be heard. All of the things you've said. Secondly, I think a criticism of government is we have to hold departments to a greater level of account, firstly for corruption and inefficiency, and secondly, a greater return on the investment. Of all the money we spend, about 237 billion goes to economic services. Actually, we need to demand more for that, and I think you would agree with me that there has to be a better return on investment. I leave you with one thought. I woke up this morning knowing that today we have to collect 52 billion rand. Spare a thought for me. You know how much a billion is? Okay? Tomorrow morning I'll wake up knowing that we have to collect almost 300 billion before we can make the number that the minister has given us. So when you say your prayers tonight, remember us.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. You heard the man himself. Don't wait for the door to be open. Break it down. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. We really do appreciate your presence. For those of us in the room, there are refreshments outside. Please come join us. Thank you. Wishing you a great morning further.
Thank you.